On April 19, 1775, the first shots of the American Revolution were fired at Lexington and Concord. But were they? What if I told you that the first shots were actually fired months before and were part of a series of incidents involving gunpowder and a British general who wanted to avoid war? Before starting our episode today, I need to introduce myself. My name is Ted, and I am a new host at Footnoting History. To say that I am thrilled to be talking to you about history is an understatement of epic proportions. You can see my brief biography at the Footnoting History website, but in short, I have been passionate about history since I can remember. For me, it is a window into knowing who we are as humans. I find the most interesting elements of history are the in-between moments, the before and after of the main event, when you can really start to see the why and the how. But enough about me, let's not delay this episode any longer. In response to what became known as the Boston Tea Party, the British Parliament passed the Coercive Acts in early 1774. These quickly became known as the Intolerable Acts in the colonies. The acts were primarily directed at Massachusetts, and particularly Boston, that hotbed of discontent, with the hopes of making an example for the other colonies. The acts included stripping Massachusetts of its charter and bringing the colony completely under the control of the king, and limiting the number of town meetings to one per year. What followed was in many ways a direct response to these acts and the actions of General Thomas Gage. Thomas Gage had been in the Americas for much of his adult life, first fighting the French in the French and Indian War, and then as commander-in-chief of the British forces in North America since 1763. He was generally well regarded on both sides of the Channel, but had been a strong proponent of many of the laws included in the Coercive Acts. As he had written in 1770, 3 years before the Boston Tea Party, "I hope Boston will be called to strict account, and I think it must be plain to every man that no peace will ever be established in that province till the king nominates his council and appoints the magistrates, and that all town meetings are absolutely abolished. Whilst those meetings exist, the people will be kept in perpetual heat." Recently appointed military governor of Massachusetts, after a brief stint back in England, General Gage did not want a fight. Not because he sided with the troublemakers of Massachusetts, but rather because he was certain there were not enough British soldiers to sufficiently suppress the rebellious towns of New England. But how to achieve this suppression and deal effectively with the growing animosity towards England that had taken hold in Massachusetts without full engagement? The answer, it seemed to Gage, was simple: remove the means of war. In other words, rather than try and crush any rebellious or reactionary uprising, Gage determined the best course of action was to take from the colonists the means of the fight, remove the powder and firearms from the towns and local militias. Of course, Gage couldn't just go ask for it or take it in broad daylight. That would only increase the simmering anger. Instead, he devised a workaround. While locals all had their own firearms, most powder and arsenals of weapons were located at various so-called powder houses. These would be General Gage's targets, but he needed surprise and stealth to succeed. On September 1st, 1774, General Gage put his plan into motion. During that summer, most towns surrounding Boston had removed their powder supply from the provincial powder house located in what is now Somerville. However, the provincial reserve remained, which in actuality belonged to the king rather than the towns. The operation was planned in secrecy. General Gage ordered Lieutenant Colonel George Madison, along with over 200 men of the 4th King's Own Foot, to march to the powder house and retrieve the gunpowder. Early in the morning of September 1st, Madison and his men left their encampments and headed to Long Wharf, where 13 long boats were waiting for them. The British Navy, who was manning the boats, rowed the soldiers across the mouth of the Charles River into Boston Harbor and then up the Mystic River. They reached their landing destination at Robert Temple's farm and disembarked. After forming their column, they marched a mile to the powder house on Quarry Hill. The powder house, which still stands today, is a gray stone silo with a shingled roof rising about 30 feet in the air. Upon reaching the hill, Madison and his soldiers were met by Colonel David Phipps, the sheriff of Middlesex County. He handed over the keys to Madison. Because the powder was extremely flammable, and even the smallest spark could cause the entire place to explode, Madison had to wait until dawn so they could see, rather than using any sort of lantern or torch. When daylight finally arrived, the soldiers of the 4th worked quickly, taking 250 barrels of gunpowder. They then marched the mile back to the waiting boats and rowed safely back to Boston. Simultaneously, a small detachment of regulars had marched to Cambridge to retrieve 2 brass cannons. Cannons and powder were successfully delivered to Castle William in Boston Harbor. The operation was, by every measure, a complete success. General Gage was thrilled. He had achieved his goal of separating the means of warfare from the local militias, and not a single shot had been fired. Unfortunately for General Gage, he had drastically underestimated how the towns of Massachusetts would respond. The people of Massachusetts and across New England were shocked by what had happened. They had been caught completely unawares. Almost immediately, wild rumors began to fly about, including that Massachusetts had been robbed of all its powder, it hadn't, that 6 people had been killed, no one had been killed, and that the war had begun, it most definitely had not begun. In fact, everything that General Gage had worked hard to make sure did not happen was now rumored to have happened. I think it can be persuasively argued that Gage did not appreciate the sentiments of the majority of the people of Massachusetts and of New England. This would be the beginning of Gage's downfall. Across the towns and countryside of Massachusetts, church bells rang out, fire beacons were lit, and local militia from all over began to turn out, all heading towards Boston. By the next day, September 2nd, over 4,000 militia had arrived in the town of Cambridge, many undoubtedly seeking conflict. But the local leaders, like Gage, did not want war, and had persuaded the thousands of men to leave their firearms in the town of Watertown, so that they arrived in Cambridge with only clubs and knives. Even with no firearms, they were a formidable force. The gathered crowd of thousands marched to what was known as Tory Row, a street with numerous houses of known Tories. Luckily, cooler heads prevailed that day, and convinced the militia to return to their homes. This was more easily achieved when it was realized that no one had actually been killed during the Powder House raid, and war had not begun. General Gage had been completely caught off guard by this response, and a planned second raid in Worcester was immediately called off. With tensions high, it is interesting to wonder whether the war might have started in 1774 had that Worcester raid been carried out. Instead, it would not be until December when a second incident brought the colonies one step closer to war with the British Crown. Following the almost disaster of what became known as the Powder House Alarm, General Gage entered a period of extreme caution. Instead of going after more powder and ammunition, he began to fortify his position in Boston. It was also becoming clear to him that the rebellious nature of Boston and the surrounding towns was expanding outwards, even into the other New England colonies. It was also at this time that Gage was writing to London showing he was getting more and more worried and nervous, even advising suspending the coercive acts, the very laws he had adamantly supported, until more troops could be sent to Boston. His requests and concerns were completely dismissed by King George. On the other side, local leaders knew they had been caught completely unawares and vowed never to be again. In October, the First Provincial Congress met in Massachusetts, creating a Committee of Safety and a Committee of Supplies. Around the same time, Paul Revere, yes, that Paul Revere, formed an association of mechanics with the goal of keeping an eye on British goings-on and to warn towns if there was ever movement again to capture powder. It is interesting to note that Gage knew about this clandestine group of mechanics, but decided to do nothing about it. He was able to gain a deep understanding of what was going on with the leaders because of Dr. Benjamin Church, himself one of the colonial leaders and revolutionary, who also happened to be a spy and informant for General Gage, although that is another story. Perhaps this is why Gage decided not to go after Paul Revere and his mechanics. By December 1774, General Gage seems to have somewhat regained his nerve. It was well known that a large store of ammunition sat at Fort William and Mary, located at the mouth of the Piscataqua River on Newcastle Island, protecting Portsmouth Harbor in New Hampshire. Local leaders, including Paul Revere, received intelligence that Gage was sending warships to New Hampshire. This information was not exactly true. While there were several British warships along the coast, including the HMS Somerset and a large contingent of Marines, there's no hard evidence that Gage actually ordered his troops to take and fortify Fort William and Mary. Nevertheless, determined not to be caught unawares again, Paul Revere rode from Boston on December 13th on one of his much less famous rides. The distance was greater than 50 miles, and the weather was frigidly cold, with significant snow and ice on the roads. Revere rode all morning, reaching Portsmouth in the early afternoon, going straight to the local committee of correspondence. On hearing the news that General Gage had sent his regulars north, local leader Samuel Curtis sent messengers out to sound the alarm. This time, unlike the September powder alarm, militia and townspeople would not be caught unawares. On December 14th, 200 militia gathered in Portsmouth with over 1,000 on their way. They were led by Major General John Sullivan, who was also a New Hampshire delegate to the Continental Congress, and later would be a general in the Continental Army. Sullivan would gain fame, or perhaps infamy, by leading one of the most controversial campaigns of the war against the Iroquois of western New York. But now in the winter of 1774, the New Hampshire militia marched to the Piscataqua River, boarded 2 gondolas, and crossed to Newcastle Island after being joined by 150 more men. The now 350-man force marched to the east side of the island where the fort stood. Watching them approach was the 6 soldiers stationed at the fortress, including their captain, John Cochrane. On hearing the demand to surrender the fort, Captain Cochrane, perhaps foolhardily, refused. He had at his disposal 3 4-pound cannons, which got off 3 rounds as the militiamen scaled the walls. Not a single man was injured, and very rapidly they overwhelmed the 6 defenders. Once the fort was secured, the attackers began to lower the British flag, but Captain Cochrane became enraged and raised his sword, which had been returned to him after the surrender, rushed the attackers. He was quickly beaten back, but as one of Cochrane's men charged forward to protect his captain, a militiaman raised his pistol to fire. Luckily, the gun backfired, and the man quickly recalibrated, smashing the butt of the pistol into the attacking soldier. In the end, local militia took over 100 barrels of gunpowder, and by December 15th, over 1,000 militia had arrived, taking what remained of the muskets and light cannons. The sighting of 2 British ships off the coast, which had finally made their way through the stormy seas, was enough for the New Hampshire militia to disperse, dissolving into the wintry countryside. The larger cannons were left behind, but the powder and ammunition were taken. So, what might have been the first shots of the American Revolution became nothing more than a footnote of history, albeit one of a number of footnotes eventually leading to that fateful day in April. The final footnote that I will cover here, and in keeping with the theme of this episode, is another powder alarm. This one happened once again in Massachusetts, and brought the 2 sides one step closer to war. After the failure and embarrassment at Fort William and Mary, and a handful of other smaller incidents in Connecticut and Rhode Island, where locals confiscated more powder and arms, General Gage decided to strike once more. Gage began planning another attack in February, after hearing reports that a large supply of munitions was being collected in Salem, Massachusetts, including 8 new brass cannons from across the ocean. The guns were not actually from across the sea, but rather old ship's guns. Nevertheless, the concentration of powder and ammunition was concerning, and while the response to the Powder House raid had been less than ideal, the raid itself had been extremely successful. General Gage gave the command of the expedition to Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Leslie and the 64th Foot Regiment. As before, their goals were to get to Salem in secret, obtain the powder and arms, and with no bloodshed return to the safety of Boston. Our old friend Paul Revere again makes an appearance in this drama, as he, or some of his compatriots, got wind of what was happening. A day before the operation was to commence, 3 of Revere's mechanics rode to Castle Island, where it was rumored the 64th was preparing for departure. But those men were found and arrested. At least one historian has suggested that this intelligence was leaked to Revere in order for them to fall into the exact trap they did. Early in the morning of February 26, the 64th Foot left the island without detection. Once again, taking boats, they rowed across Massachusetts Bay, reaching the town of Marblehead at 9 a.m. It was Sunday, and the soldiers were given the order to wait quietly until the residents of Marblehead went to their meeting houses for afternoon sermons. Between 2 and 3 in the afternoon, on order from Colonel Leslie, the British regulars began advancing toward Salem. While Colonel Leslie seemed confident in his success since he ordered fifes and drums to be played, in fact, local residents had already spotted the soldiers and began to spread the alarm. One wonders whether anything would have been different if this had been Gage's first attempt at securing powder and arms, and the locals had not been on their guard. Although the British had successfully surprised the local leaders, they were not as unprepared as before. Major John Pedrick, a member of the Marblehead Committee of Safety, was determined to warn Salem. It must have been obvious where the British regulars were headed. Unfortunately for Pedrick, there was only one road between Marblehead and Salem, and the British soldiers were marching down that very road. Fortunately for the major, Colonel Leslie was the utmost gentleman, and when he saw John Pedrick riding slowly alongside his regiment, he ordered his men to let the rider pass. As soon as Pedrick was out of sight, he spurred his horse forward, making his mad dash to Salem before the soldiers arrived. He came to the home of Colonel David Mason and gave him the news. Mason in turn ran to the meeting house, where the afternoon meeting was in full swing. With the news of the approaching British soldiers spreading through town, bells began to toll and drums beat, mustering the militia. At the same time, locals rushed to hide arms and ammunition. In order to delay the marching soldiers, townsmen ran to a small bridge where they ripped up some of the planking. However, the bridge was soon repaired, and the soldiers continued on into Townhouse Square. One report noted that local Tories went up to Colonel Leslie and whispered in his ear, at which point he ordered his men to march in the direction of the hidden cannons. There was a second bridge over the North River that the force would have to cross to reach their destination, but this one was a drawbridge. When Colonel Leslie and his men arrived, they found the bridge up, and a large contingent of militia gathered around the bridge, some even sitting on top of the raised platform. Colonel Leslie demanded the bridge be lowered, but the Salem men refused, claiming the road belonged to the town. By this time the crowd had begun to grow, many hurling taunts at the frustrated soldiers. Marblehead men had also come up now, joining the Salem militia. At this point, Colonel Leslie seems to have noticed 3 gundelows in the river. He quickly ordered his men to take them so they might be able to cross. But the militia also noticed them and raced to get to them first. As the confrontation escalated, a Salem man named Joseph Witcher tore his shirt open, exposing his chest. A soldier with a bayonet fixed stabbed upward, nicking Witcher's bare chest. The mood among all involved began to grow more and more hostile, and the men of Salem and Marblehead began to crowd around the British soldiers. It was then that a local minister named Thomas Barnard stepped forward and began to speak directly with Colonel Leslie. Leslie did not want to fight. His orders had been to quietly and secretly secure the gunpowder. So far, he had failed the mission completely, and it was beginning to grow late in the day. He readily agreed to a proposal from Barnard. The bridge was lowered. The British soldiers marched 100 yards across to the forge, where a quick search revealed no weapons, ammunition, or powder. As had been hastily agreed to, since nothing was found, Colonel Leslie and his men turned around and began the march out of Salem, returning to Boston. Of the 3 incidents described here, this last one, the Salem powder alarm as it became known, was the most embarrassing and most damaging for Gage and the British presence in Massachusetts. Not only had he failed in securing any further gunpowder, he had provided the local Whig leaders and militia an increased sense of confidence that in the growing confrontational atmosphere, as long as the town stood their ground, Gage would back down. As I noted earlier, there were other smaller, less heated incidents between September 1774 and May 1775. The final one would occur on April 19, 1775, in the small Massachusetts towns of Lexington and Concord. Unlike the previous engagements, the shots fired on that day would indeed, as Ralph Waldo Emerson would later write, be heard round the world. Thank you for joining me for the story of the powder alarms. Don't forget to head over to footnotinghistory.com for further reading suggestions related to everything we discussed today. We're glad you're here, and remember, the best stories are always in the footnotes.